welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica. I am your host, and I am back with one of our absolute favorite guests. I think that Jen called you friend of the show last time, so I'm going to call you a friend of the show, friend of us. Mike Chen, welcome back.
Hello, thank you for having me back.
Always. Literally, we stalk your book release schedule, and we're just like, oh, it's time to reach out to Mike again. It's we haven't
Cool.
seen Mike in a while. So tell us about Quantum Love Story, because this was super fun. I think one of the things that I love most about pretty much everything you do is that your projects are always super unique. Even when you're playing with certain tropes, you find really good ways to just subvert what you're thinking is going to happen and making it into some really fresh story. So Quantum Love Story, tell us about that and where it came from.
So, A Quantum Love Story is my time loop book, and it is most time loop books. I feel like it's like one person, they have 24 hours, and they're trying to figure out a way out of this. What I wanted to do with this book was trap two people in a time loop and use their growing relationship as kind of like his mechanism to explore their own grief and trauma, and then throw some semi-realistic science in the way there too. And so it is about a woman named Mariana and a man named Carter who wind up coming together in this time loop. And Carter's the first one there, and he kind of grabs Mariana and gets her into the time loop. And they are stuck together for 4 days at a time. And as they progressively try to escape the time loop and like conduct experiments, they're also learning to slow down and try to enjoy the gifts of the time loop, which is like your bank accounts reset, your health resets, all things like that. And so as they are trying to do that and get to know each other, they gradually start to find that like they kind of complete each other in a way. They're both very different people. And then something happens at the midpoint of the book, and it forces them to make some hard decisions. And I don't want to spoil the second half of the book.
Please don't. And I really liked it. It was really good. The characters were really interesting. And I have to say, like, I enjoy the idea of a time loop because there is a lot that can be done with it. I think my first introduction to a time loop story was Groundhog's Day.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of like the foundational media for time loops.
Although I'm sure, and now I'm having trouble remembering, I'm sure that the Twilight Zone had done it because the Twilight Zone had done many things. So now
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember at least one Twilight Zone time loop story. And as soon as we finish this interview, I'm going to be like, it was that one. And why don't I remember it? But yeah, it really does. It really is kind of a fun sandbox to play in because you can almost like rewrite your scene as it goes along with the characters having knowledge of what needs to be rewritten, which is really interesting. So Mariana and Carter are very, very different people, as you mentioned, but they fit together really, really well. Where did they kind of come in? Did the time loop idea come first, or did Mariana and Carter come first?
So this book has an interesting history in that like the Mariana and Carter, they were originally part of a different proposal. This book actually had like I think maybe 4 or 5 different iterations. And this proposal, I can't say what it was from, but it was a pretty popular IP. And the IP editors had read Here and Now and Then. They said, "Can you do something like that with these characters?" And I wrote a proposal for it, and it's a timey-wimey proposal, but not quite a time loop. And so that project just never got off the ground for whatever reason. And then I got approached from another publisher. They said, like, can you do something that's kind of like a time loop, but in like this context? And I said, like, well, I had this other idea and like let's see if we can rearrange it into this. And so they kind of grew into like more original characters. And then that didn't get off the ground. It was they wanted it for a graphic novel, and we had some ideas in it where it was like each loop, like the graphic novel would take on like a different type of art style to kind of show what was happening. And then finally, like I had been with these characters now through several iterations, and I'm like, I really like them. What if I make them a novel and take away like the thriller aspect of it and really focus more on like them as people? And that's where this came from. So they all kind of grew together, like both who they were and then the concept of the time loop. And it would just seem like the idea that I think if you take two different people and you kind of stick them in like the same circumstances over and over and over, like their faults and their best qualities will gradually show to them. And so that's kind of the unique thing about the time loop. And it was also a lot of it was drafted and kind of being conceptualized in like 2020 2021, when I mean we were all in a time loop in a way. And a lot of there was a lot of inspiration that came from my daughter. She had made this friend who is like lives like 500 miles away. Like they became friends because I'm friends with their mom, because she writes comics and she writes books. And we had always said like, if we work a con together, it would be really great if we could bring our kids, because we feel like they would really get along. They both like Adventure Time and Miyazaki films and these things that like their classmates don't really like. And then the pandemic happened and we're like, well, we can't see our friends right now. And then we're like, what if they tried watching TV together on Zoom? Like it started as that. And it was this interesting feeling of like, every week they would just get together and like they're still really close friends. Like they play like Among Us and Minecraft and other stuff on Nintendo Switch like several times a month. But it was really interesting thinking that like this horrible, horrible thing happened to all of us, and it kind of trapped us in this loop. And because of it, these two kids became really close friends. And for the like first maybe year of their friendship together, it was like every week, like, okay, we're gonna watch a new show together. And because the world has not changed yet enough for us to resume it. And so I got a lot of inspiration in that too when I was looking at like how do you build a relationship in a time loop. It was just like you're stuck here, nothing changes, but everything changes. And how do people grow from that?
Wow. I have so many questions.
Okay, go
But the
for it.
first but the first one I'm really gonna ask you, I mean, because I don't want to spoil anything, like you mentioned, uh the food aspect
Oh
of the
yeah.
book. Where did that come from? Um,
So
yeah.
in the book, Carter is this kind of ridiculous foodie who, like, he spends his time loop. He's like, hey, my bank account's reset every 4 days. So I'm just going to order like 5 meals from my favorite restaurants and just have everything that I could never afford. And Mariana is very much like, I don't care about food. I'm going to have a breakfast shake, and like it doesn't matter to me. And so Carter is my wife who always orders like an extra meal to try because she's like, we could bring it home for leftovers. It could be lunch. And I've always wanted to try this dish. And I'm like, I don't care. Like 90% of food it falls into the same category of like pretty good for me. And so my wife was reading this and she's like, we've had these discussions. I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, we have. Like we totally have. So like the foodie aspect of Carter is totally my wife. And like she would absolutely, if we were in a time loop, she would order 5 different dishes for breakfast like every day. And just indulge and like maybe even just one bite out of them just to try it. So yeah, that's where that comes from.
I mean, like that was super fun. It definitely added something to the book. And I will say that I am totally like Carter. I can't say that I necessarily order an extra meal to take home, but I do look at the menu and often think about like, what will this taste like the next day? Can I eat it cold? Because I'm kind of like iffy about what I allow myself to reheat, because not everything tastes good reheated.
Yes.
You know, but and I have all sorts of theories about that, but I'm not going to get into them. But I do totally get that. So I would say that I am on board with that, and it added like this just sort of fun thing to his character. But in general, like some other things, you know, that I really loved about the book was Mariana. So, you know, they both have like a science background, although they kind of went in different directions with
Hmm.
it. And Mariana, she's mourning a friend. She has this, I suppose, ambiguous loss is really the way to
Yeah.
describe the situation. Her friend Shay is presumed dead, but it's not clear. You know,
Hmm.
she knows that Shay is gone. Shay went to Joshua Tree, and then we're not really sure from there. You know, and this is what you find out very early when you meet Mariana. She's in care of Maggie, who
Hmm.
is Shay's cat.
You may hear the real Maggie outside this door
Oh,
right here
nice.
now. Maggie is based on our cat Maggie, who is just like Maggie in the book, fluffy, a dwarf cat genetically, so she's only like 6 pounds, really annoying and demanding. And so because I have closed the door behind me, you may actually hear her going meow, meow, meow in the background.
I would love it. I actually have to say I am a huge fan of when people's pets crash podcasts. Especially, I will never, my favorite ever, and I know I've mentioned this several times on Turn the Page. Like, if you've heard me mention this, I'm sorry that you're probably tired of hearing about this, but Alyssa Cole was interviewing from Martinique, and she had a rooster, and that rooster was very invested in our conversation. Like, whenever we talk about like something really intense in her book, which was, I think, When No One's Watching was the book that we were talking about, the rooster would just be like, yes, and crow at that very moment. So Maggie is welcome to meow whenever she wants. But yeah, so Mariana is in, she's in care of Maggie, but she's so heavily mourning Shay. She and
Mhm.
Shay have, you know, one of these really rare friendships. You know, there's different nuances to it, which again, I'll leave that out just so the readers can really get to it. But there's, you know, she's missing her, and this is part of what brings her into Carter's path. So like missing one person and meeting another,
Mhm.
it just sort of fit the puzzle of the time loop really, really well. Can you talk a little bit about relive? Because I thought that that was very interesting.
Sure. So the idea here is like, well, relive is within the universe of the book. Relive is this neurological drug that Mariana is working on. She's a neuroscientist, and this drug is designed to like you inject it in people so that it helps preserve the like the vibrance of their memories, and it's intended to uh give people, like, as they get older, as their memories fade and as their like cognition fades, it's intended to allow them to still have access to like these really key moments in their life. And so as the book opens, so Mariana is like overseeing this project, and they are giving a tour of this project to the accelerator where Carter is working at, and they don't know why the accelerator team is interested in this neurological product. They just know that, you know, they want it for some reason. But Mariana has very illegally and secretively taken a dose of it herself because she is so worried about losing. Like, her best friend has been missing for several months, and presumed dead. And so she does not want to lose that aspect of her life. And so she illegally injects herself with this drug, and that's where where we catch up with her at the beginning of the story. And that is one of the mechanisms that we find out is why she can remember through the time loop. Is like, that is one of the variables in there. But it is a book about processing grief. in many, many different forms. And that's where a lot of like, the pandemic inspiration was, like where we were all stuck, kind of in a loop during that time. And processing trauma is, you can basically just get in a loop from it. And in order to get out of it, and that's one of the themes of this book, in order to get out of it, sometimes there's no trick to it. You just have to like confront it, and as deep and as lengthy as it is, you just have to go through it. And so that's really where like the basis of this was. And also from like a science fiction perspective, I needed a mechanism for Mariana to be able to remember the loop.
You talk a little bit about the science in this book,
Mhm.
because that is always something I find really interesting in science fiction. There was something very tangible about it.
It was so I will say that like the trick with science fiction, so I have an engineering background, I have an engineering degree, and I'm pretty critical of science in science fiction. Not that like the science has to be real, but it has to be consistent and it makes sense, because I find that like if it's not consistent, then it kind of breaks that sort of illusion. And it's been interesting seeing reader feedback where they'll say like, oh well, this book is really based in science, and I'm like, it's not. I made it up. But it's logical enough that it makes consistent sense. And so in terms of like this time loop, the rules of the time loop are very consistent. The mechanism for breaking it is consistent. There has to be tangible things for them to experiment with in order to bring it from loop to loop. Because otherwise, you can decide when you're writing a book like this, you have to decide like, is the time loop based in science or is it based in magic? Because it could be one or the other. And if it's magic, then you're going to do a different set of experiments. But if it's science, then you have to have like some sort of like qualitative like metrics that you can use to see like, are we affecting the time loop, and how are we carrying like the information over and over. So that's really where that's based on, like the idea of, the only tangible idea I will say in there is based on like quantum mechanics was like the most difficult physics course I took in college, but I had to take it for my degree. And I remember like the first week, um, the teacher like drew up, like he had this equation on the board and he had like this diagram of it, and it's about like, for the acceleration of a particle. And at some point, like if you apply enough energy to the particle, the equation goes negative. So you are actually moving like negative through time. So it's basically like a time travel equation. It's based on the Einstein E equals mc squared. There's actually like a whole bunch of other crap like at the end of that equation, but it gets simplified into E equals mc squared. Um, and so I kind of took that as like the basis for like how you could move something through time. You have to apply a certain amount of energy for it, and it has to compensate for like the mass that it's trying to move in there. That's like the only like kernel of real science in there. The rest of it is fake science, but applied very, very consistently. And you need that consistency for it to feel real.
You did an amazing job.
Well, that's good. Apparently people bought it enough.
You
So
did a
that,
really, really good job.
I do have like
Because
a giant spreadsheet about like what are the rules of this. Because when I do world building for things like that, I feel like you have to have consistent rules, like I said, or otherwise it breaks.
do your characters ever throw monkey wrenches into it though? Like when you're writing a character, does your character ever do something that you didn't expect them to do?
Yeah, I think that's part of the fun of it. I am a very significant outliner when I do planning. Um, and I've gotten to a point now where like each manuscript, so my books are typically like 90 to 100,000 words. I've gotten to a point where my outlines themselves will be about 10,000 words. So they're like almost like a novella. They're pretty deep in there. but I give enough wiggle room that like if I feel like, I mean, it feels kind of weird to say that like, your characters are talking to you, but you get to know their decision making process. And if I feel like one of them would just be like, actually, let's not do that. Let's do this instead. Then I will tease it out and think about the book as a whole, and see what kind of ripple effects it would cause. Generally, like I don't when that has happened, it's more of like an emotional ripple effect rather than like a plotting ripple effect. Like the plot tends to still stay on the same path, but their reactions to things like internally are completely different from that point on. And I think that's part of the fun of writing. I mean, it's basically, I joke that like, it's like playing a role playing game in your head. It's like you rolled a critical or you rolled a failure instead, and now you have to see what happens, but you're still kind of on like the DM's path for solving this problem.
That's an amazing analogy. I love it.
That's what you get for, someone who's like played video games and role playing games their entire life.
So this book in general, it's a love story. What did you always know it was going to be?
I tried to, so that was one of the things. Once I identified that I really wanted this to be a story about two people who have unexpectedly come into each other's lives. Um, I have never used romance as like the motivating factor for like the A plot of a story. It's always kind of been like this B plot that like kind of moves character arcs along, but I wanted it to be like central to like the motivation. And so when we were talking, the original title for this book was called Tomorrow is Another Day, which I took from an excellent song by the band Ladytron. And then my editorial team, they said like the straightforward titles are kind of in trend right now. So they're like, what could some sort of straightforward title be? And I said like a time loop romance, and they're like, no, this isn't a romance because like romance comes with certain genre things. And you've only got like two kisses in this whole book. And so I'm like, so we were talking about like what are the themes of this? And I said like it is about two people who find each other, and now they have to like kind of fight to give themselves a chance to be together. And they said, okay, well, it's a love story then, it's which is different from romance. And I said, okay, well, there you go, a time loop love story. And they said like, well, no, we don't want to use the word time loop in the title, but then they came up with quantum because quantum implies time stuff. And so I'm like, perfect, let's take it. So yeah, it was always baked into it from the very beginning. Like once I knew like what the concept of the book was going to be, it's like I wanted to focus on this. I want to write a story about like two people finding each other and understanding like why they are good for each other, and I want that to be like the driving factor for like how they're going to make decisions, especially when things start falling apart.
Excellent. It was really good. I recommend it to anybody. Before we close out, you have nods to the live action Cowboy Bebop with these characters, don't you?
Oh yes. So one of the tricks, one of the shortcuts that I do when I'm writing is very early on, I will cast actors in the roles. And it's a writing shortcut that I recommend for all writers because you have this catalog of like facial expressions and like, the vocal cadence, their gait. You have that to refer to when you're like, God, how are they going to look when they look confused or something like that? In this book, I actually got pretty far in the first draft where I hadn't cast them yet. I knew like I knew what their ethnicities were going to be, based like I had and I kind of knew like roughly who they were, but I'm like nothing really like locked in yet. And so I actually had placeholders for like how are like, they look mad or like, they look confused or whatever, but I couldn't describe it just yet. And the live action Cowboy Bebop had just come out, and I really enjoyed it. And like I'm someone who's like I grew up with the anime, and I'm like this is different, but this casting is perfect. The tone is great. I'm still mad they canceled it. I'm mad that
It was really beautiful,
the
and
casting was
yeah.
so spot on, and like Netflix has canceled so many shows that I love now, but that's another discussion. But so like when I was writing this, I'm like, oh, Carter and Mariana. It's like I look at John Cho and Danielle Pineda. I'm like, they fit perfectly. I'm just gonna like drop them in from Cowboy Bebop. Like I'm gonna drop them physically in, and I'm gonna adapt their personalities to these actors, and so that's where they came from, and it just makes writing so much easier if you can cast them right away.
So, but again, before we close out, this is a
Mhm.
time loop of an interview. What are your favorite time loop stories?
So okay, one of my favorite ones that I don't think a lot of people know. I am urging everyone who loves goofy superhero stories to go watch DC's Legends of Tomorrow, which was canceled on a cliffhanger at the end of their 7th season, which really sucks. Um, Go watch Legends of Tomorrow. Ignore the first season. The first season is terrible. After that, they totally lean into like being goofy and queer, and it's awesome. Like there is a excellent time loop episode in there called "Here I Go Again," which is named after the Whitesnake '80s rock song. um, and it just treated time loops a little bit differently without spoilers, but it's a really great character episode. So that's got to be the top of it. Star Trek Discovery had a really unique time loop episode in their first season, and I forget the name. It was something like "Magic Makes the Sanest Man Go Mad," something like that. It's the episode with Harry Mudd. But if you've never seen Discovery, but you already know the concept of like Star Trek basics, like what Starfleet is and things like that, then that's a really, really good time loop episode. And then, of course, there's the Star Trek Next Generation Cause and Effect, which is just like a standard, like one of the standard bearers for time loops.
Awesome. So check out Quantum Love Story. What else is coming up on your slate, by the way? Anything? Are you working on anything?
So my next book comes out in October. It is a Marvel book. It's book 3 in a series of What If books. So book 1 actually comes out really soon, and it's by Madeline Rowe. And that one, her book is focuses on Loki and Valkyrie. And my book, or the second book, is Peter Parker and Wanda Maximoff. And then my book is book 3, and it's Moon Knight and Venom. And it is what if Moon Knight was a host to Venom, which when they gave me that pitch, I was like, oh my God, please let me write this book. um, and it's a 5-book arc. There's an overarching plot that connects all these books together, but then each book focuses on a set of characters. And that comes out in October. It's in revision stages right now. I think it's pretty close to being done. It depends on what the editorial team says. Hopefully I will get a very nice email from them in the next week or two. But that comes out in October. And that was a lot of fun to write. I looked at a lot of photos of Oscar Isaac for that one. So, tough job.
Oh, tough. Oh, that's really hard, right?
Yeah,
Like
like Googling like Oscar Isaac hair. So I'm like, okay, this is a fun job.
Yeah.
And then after that, things are still kind of top secret. Hopefully, within like a few months, I'll be able to say something else about that.
Mike, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Please come back. We can relive part of this conversation if you want, or just talk about something else.
That's true. We can always talk about Moon Knight and Venom in October if you want.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right. So this is Jessica. Our guest today was Mike Chen, and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.